1895 and 1950. The time was ripe for a heresy. 180 years ago, in 1773, Pierre Simon de Laplace, 1749 to 1827, then 23 years old, stood before the Académie des Sciences in Paris and read a paper in which he proved the stability of the solar system. All deflections of the planets from their paths are only periodic oscillations from their mean courses, and the celestial mechanism is wound up to go on forever. Laplace's contemporary, Jean-Baptiste de Lamarck, 1744 to 1829, set out to demonstrate in a series of works that this Earth has ever been a peaceful abode of evolution, free from spasmodic disturbances, in opposition to the dominant ways of his day. These ideas of harmony or stability in the celestial and terrestrial spheres gained ground in the 19th century and became the foundation of scientific thought. In 1846, Leverrier, by announcing the existence of the planet Neptune, which was immediately thereafter discovered in the part of the sky indicated by him, proved the gravitational theory of Newton and the orderly universe of Laplace to be correct. However, in the same year, by detecting the anomaly in the revolution of Mercury, always accumulating in one and the same direction, he threw the first doubt on the infallibility of these very laws. The theory of uniformity, as understood by Lamarck and Hutton, was developed by Lyell, became the cornerstone of Darwinian theory, and Darwin went so far as to say that anybody who was unconvinced by Lyell's teaching should refrain from reading The Origin of Species. The principle of uniformity, or the explanation of all past events in the history of the globe, and in terms of the processes in action in our own age, or the denial of catastrophic crisis in the past, gave Darwin what he needed most for his idea of the origin of species: almost unlimited time, in order that from the struggle for existence or competition new forms should evolve, and that an animal like the spider with its many legs and human beings should have had a common ancestor. Untold eons were necessary. By the end of the 19th century, the war between the theory of evolution and the theory of creation in 6 days, less than 6,000 years ago, was concluded with victory to the theory of evolution. The difficulty left was, in the view of Thomas Huxley, that no really new species had appeared on the world scene since the scientific observations were made. Not even the breeding experiments. The breeding experiments, just what would that be about?
Very interesting.
The geological record, however, spoke unequivocally of the fact, in the past, lived animal forms that do not live any longer. And of those forms that live in our age, many were not present in the geological past. Laplace's theory of the origin of the solar system, of a rotating nebula, was replaced by the end of the century with a theory of a catastrophic beginning in a near collision of the Sun with another star, with debris forming the planets. Isn't that interesting? And what star was that other star? And where did that information come from? But it was stressed by the authors of this new theory that the universe is orderly, and this beginning in a cataclysm was an unusually rare occurrence in the cosmos, and that the solar system is governed by the principle of stability, as enunciated by Laplace, and the Earth by a law of uniformity, in the animals and plants by the law of evolution, through continuity. It appeared that basic principles having been established, science had before it only the work of refinement and observation, and in the addition of details for perfection of knowledge. But the time of basic discoveries was over. This was the outlook in 1895. In April of that year,
Fridtjof Nansen,
in an attempt to discover the North Pole, reached a point less than 4 degrees from it. The scientific world looked upon the discovery of the North Pole as the most coveted goal still left to be attained by science. But before Nansen, drifting from latitude 8614, reached his home in Norway, the scene changed. Conrad Röntgen of Würzburg discovered the X-rays, or cathode rays, that pass through opaque bodies. In the same year of 1895, 20-year-old Marconi, working at the home of his father near Bologna, made the first successful experiment with wireless transmission. Okay, now I have read that he ripped off Tesla when he was his understudy, and that Bologna was notorious for having self-important
tricksters and evildoers.
intellectuals there that were made fun of by a comedy troupe, and that's where the saying, "you're full of baloney," came from. That year, too, Sigmund Freud published his first paper, together with Joseph Breuer, which led to a new understanding of the realm known as the subconscious. And at the same time, Pavlov made his contribution to the psychology of the reflexes. Pavlov's dog. The next year, and still before Nansen had landed on the Norwegian coast, Henry Becquerel, working on uranium, discovered the phenomena of radioactivity. 2 years later, he was followed by the Curies, who discovered radium. In 1897, J.J. Thomson announced that the atom is divisible and is actually a microcosm. And he was followed by Rutherford. In 1900, Planck presented the theory of quanta, or energies dispatched in bundles or shots, and not in a continuous stream. And in the field of origin of species, in 1900, Van Vries announced mutations in plants, observed for the first time, a process of spontaneous changes in living nature fundamentally different from the process of evolution through continuity as postulated by Darwin. Thus, in a few years, in a spectacular series of discoveries, the entire world, matter and energy, and living species, and the human soul opened new horizons, and everything appeared to be incessant vibration, collisions, and transformation, the macrocosm, the microcosm, and even the subtle world of the mind, all alike. That's interesting. It's just like that today. And in 1905, Albert Einstein, then 26 years old, offered his understanding of the physical world, an understanding that required a new mental approach, or so it was thought, and single-handedly set science back 150 years. I've heard it said before that just prior to World War I, there was a major wake-up going on. That kind of makes you think about, World War I ruined everything. When it was over, and after the Spanish flu killed another 50 million people, Salvador Dali and Einstein emerged as a testimonial that the age of basic discoveries had not ended with the victory of Darwin over the book of Genesis. Since then, another 50 years have passed, once more, as before, the end of the 19th century. We are told that the fundamentals are all known. The age of basic discoveries is definitely terminated, this time for certain, and present and future generations will have to satisfy themselves with detecting details, accumulating data, and adding decimals. And though the exciting decade of 1895 to 1905 threw light on processes in matter, life, and soul, processes that are certainly not inert and are marked by spontaneity and conflict, science in its various branches adjusted the new discoveries and ideas to the framework of the old great principle reigning equally in lifeless and living nature, the law of harmony and unperturbed stability. The time was ripe for heresy. In 1950, a book, Worlds in Collision, created an outburst of emotions almost unprecedented in science. I came upon the idea that traditions and legends and memories of generic origin can be treated in the same way in which we treat psychoanalysis. The early memories of a single individual. I spent 10 years on this work. I found that the collective memory of humankind spoke of a series of global catastrophes that occurred in historical times. I believe that I could even identify the exact times and the very agents of the great upheavals of the more recent past. The conclusions at which I arrived compelled me to cross the frontiers into various fields of science, archaeology, geology, and astronomy. The result was a book, a prolegomena. In its concluding pages, I conceded that more problems were raised than had been solved, and I promised, always reckoning with the limitations of the individual scholar, to pursue my study into these fields too. But already the implications of the fact of great global catastrophes on the Earth, one of the celestial bodies in a time so recent, had caused my critics to assert, in the words of a Harvard astronomer, that here was the most amazing example of a shattering of accepted concepts on record. In the heat of the debate, in the press of the book, was pronounced one of the most significant books written since the invention of printing, and also the worst book since the invention of movable characters, believing that an emotional atmosphere is not well suited to fruitful debate.
Fascinating.
I have entered only infrequently into the controversy. I have made short factual corrections of statements by the Royal Astronomer and by J.B.S. Haldane, B.S. Haldane, appearing in their reviews of my book, and I participated in a debate with your professor of astronomy, J.Q. Stewart, in the pages of Harper's Magazine, June 1951. I appeared before the American Philosophical Society, which, at its annual meeting in April 1952, held a symposium on some orthodoxies of modern science. My unorthodoxy being the chief subject on the agenda. Otherwise, I have kept myself out of the verbal conflict. Now, more than 3.5 years have passed since the publication of the book, and I appreciate the opportunity offered me by your invitation to present a dispassionate review of recent finds in the 3 fields named in the title of my address: Worlds in Collision and Recent Finds in Archaeology. In my book, I describe the great natural catastrophes of the 2nd and 1st millennia before the present era. Prominence is given to the description of the natural upheaval that occurred in the closing hours of the Middle Kingdom in Egypt. I synchronized this event with the Exodus, when sea, land, and sky were in uproar. The collective human memory retained an inexhaustible array of recollections of a time when the world was in conflagration, when sea engulfed land, earth trembled, the celestial bodies were disturbed in their motions, meteorites fell. My narrative is based on historical texts of many peoples around the globe, and that is the key. Classical literature, on epics of northern races, on sacred books of the Orient and Occident, on traditions and the folklore of primitive peoples. The question that arose was, where's the archaeological evidence? In later chapters of my book, I gave such evidence. Water clocks and sundials that show a different length of the day, or altered latitudes, change in orientation of ancient temples, which originally faced toward the east, but do so no longer. I also closely examined in my book the calendars of the civilized peoples of antiquity, from Mexico and Peru to Greece, Iran, Israel, Egypt, Babylon, Assyria, India, and China, and the calendar reforms that were made. All this material gave strong support to the literary evidence. Working independently of me, Professor Claude Schaefer, whose earlier excavations at Ras Shamara, Ugarit, caused a complete revolution in biblical exegesis, published a volume, Stratigraphie Comparie et Chronologie, G.D. Lycée Occidental, printed by Oxford University Press. In this very detailed and technical work, comprising, together with tables, almost 1,000 pages, Schaeffer demonstrates that on several occasions, each marking the end of an epoch, the entire ancient East was shaken and devastated. Modern annals of seismology know nothing comparable in severity and extent. The most devastating of these upheavals took place at exactly the end of the Middle Kingdom in Egypt, causing its downfall, as claimed in Worlds in Collision and Ages in Chaos. Cities were overturned. Epidemics left the dead piled in common graves. The pursuit of arts and commerce came to an abrupt end. Empires ceased to exist. Strata of earth dust and ashes, yards thick, covered the ruined city. In many places, the population was annihilated. In others, it was decimated. Settled living was replaced by nomadic existence. Climate changed. Claude Schaeffer analyzed the archaeological finds of every place excavated from Troy to the Dardanelles, over all Asia Minor, Armenia, Caucasus, Persia, Syria, Cyprus, Palestine, to Egypt and Africa. He summarizes his extensive volume. Thus, our inquiry has demonstrated that these repeated crises, which opened and closed the principal periods of the third and second millennia, were not caused by the action of a man. Far from it, because compared with the vastness of these all-embracing crises and their profound effects, the exploits of conquerors would appear only insignificant. Schaeffer's work sheds a new light on the conclusions at which Sir Arthur Evans arrived after many years of archaeological work on Crete. The island was shattered in violent catastrophes that were accompanied by fire, and in these upheavals the cultural and political ages of the Minoan kingdom went down. At the same time, the corresponding Egyptian ages were terminated. Troy III was destroyed, and its 50 feet thick fortress wall fell when the Middle Kingdom in Egypt fell. The volcano on the island of Thera exploded, and the most unimaginable fury. Recent archaeological work in the Indus Valley showed, too, that about minus 1500, and in advance of the Aryan invasion, cities with great walls were destroyed, and a flourishing civilization came to a sudden end. The synchronization of the Exodus with the end of the Middle Kingdom was also the starting point of a reconstruction of ancient history. From that point on to the advent of Alexander the Great, which took the form of a 2-volume work, Ages in Chaos, the first volume of which was published in the spring of 1952. The problem of the time of the Exodus in Egyptian history had never been solved. The papyrus of Ipuwer, the Naos of El Arish, I found descriptions of a natural upheaval very similar, sometimes identical, with the description in the book of Exodus. Following plagues, when the river was blood color, amid a hurricane and darkness of 7 days' duration. The Pharaoh and his host were drowned in a whirlpool at Pi Ka Karath, the same place where the Pharaoh of the Exodus was drowned. These parallels compelled me to fix an unorthodox date, collating the historical text of following generations for 1,200 years. I could establish numerous correlations between histories of Egypt and of Israel, which could not be accidental. My reconstruction demonstrated the Egyptian history and the histories of the nations which were written in harmony with it are set out of line with the historical past by about 600 to 700 years. Thus, in my works, have there been a starting point in the recognition that the Middle Kingdom in Egypt went down in a great natural catastrophe. The recent excavation in Jericho has confirmed the fact that the great walls of the city fell a few decades after the end of the Middle Kingdom. But at the time in which conventional chronology places the arrival of the Israelites under Joshua in Canaan, there was no city at Jericho and no walls to fall. According to Ages in Chaos, however, the Israelites came to the walls of Jericho 1 generation after the song The song. I had the song in my mind. I used to sing the song in church. And the walls came tumbling down. Brought back a memory. The Israelites came to the walls of Jericho one generation after the end of the Middle Kingdom, and the enigmatic hiatus of 600 years proves not to be real. I expect new evidence from the Minoan scripts. I was just talking about them. And the so-called Hittite pictographs. And the Hittites are the ones who said Neptune was the king of heaven. Text in the Minoan Linear B script. Yep. Were found years ago on Crete and in Mycenae and several other places on the Greek mainland. I believe that when the Minoan writings unearthed in Mycenae are deciphered, they will be found to be Greek. Linear B has been found at one site only in Crete. This was at the Palace of Knossos. It has been found in many sites in Greece, including Mycenae. However, it is now known to be an early form of Greek. The Phaistos disc is the only example of the third type of writing has ever been found. It is on a decorative disc found at the palace at Phaistos. It may not be Cretan. It may have come from Anatolia. Just for snicks, I thought I'd look it up, and lo and behold, chuck up another one for Dr. Velikovsky. I also claim that these texts are of a later date than generally believed. No Dark Age of 6 centuries duration intervened in Greece between the Mycenaean and the Ionian Age of the 7th century. Before long, new evidence will come from the so-called Hittite pictograph writings found in Asia Minor, Mesopotamia, and northern Syria. I haven't heard a thing about them. Since the recent discovery of Catastrophic in Asia Minor of bilingual inscriptions in ancient Hebrew and in pictographs, efforts at decipherment have entered a new stage. Before long, new evidence will come from so-called Hittite pictograph writings found in Asia Minor. Since the recent discovery of Catastrophic in Asia Minor of bilingual inscriptions in ancient Hebrew and in pictographs, efforts at decipherment have entered a new stage. Today, the Hittite pictographs are already in the process of being read. In my reconstruction, I come to the conclusion that they are Chaldean signs, not Hittite. I also expect unequivocal evidence that these signs were used down to the last century before the present era. Owing to the confusion in conventional chronology, the Chaldean writings of the Neo-Babylonian Empire are ascribed to early centuries and an imaginary empire. W.F. Libby and his associates at the University of Chicago have developed the radiocarbon method of dating organic matter. Wood from under the foundation of the Hittite fortress of Alisar in Asia Minor turned out to be 700 to 800 years younger than conventional chronology would allow, thus giving a full support to my dating. Hittite history interwoven with Egyptian history of the New Kingdom cannot be shortened without at the same time shortening the history of Egypt. The age of pieces of wood from the tombs of the Old and Middle Kingdoms in Egypt also proved to be in harmony with my reconstruction. However, for the decisive period, that of the New Kingdom, no radiocarbon analysis has been made. Arctic Ocean in the north and the Kalima in the east. In Worlds in Collision, page 329, I expressed my belief that human settlements would be discovered farther to the north on the Kalima or Lena rivers flowing into the Arctic Ocean. On the lower Lena, north of the confluence with Vili, inside the polar circle, monuments are found of a characteristic culture. Outstanding finds were made near Lake Yolba, not far from Gigansk. As soon as the archaeologists started a methodic investigation of the area, in Yakutsk itself was found a workshop of an ancient metallurgist, in which, at the end of the second millennium, before the present era, he made bronze axes, similar to the axes manufactured about that time in the Near East and in Europe. In the Yakutsk taiga, 2.5 or 3,000 years ago, there already lived artisans in metals who were able to extract copper from ore, to melt it and pour it into forms, and to make axes, beautiful bronze tips for the spears, knives, and even swords. These relics of a civilization in the taiga of northwestern Siberia imply that the climate changed there in the age of advanced man. Before the ice froze the region, voracious members of the elephant family roamed there in large herds. Recent finds in geology. Archaeological evidence of continental upheavals in the second millennium having been presented in detail by Schaefer, the evidence of geology and paleontology called for elucidation. To this, I have dedicated a special work, now close to completion, and since it will be published before very long, I shall refer here only briefly to some of this material. A little over a decade ago, it was observed that in the gold-digging hydraulic giants in Fairbanks District in Alaska, sluicing out miles-long cuts opened great hecatombs of animals. Their numbers are appalling. The Bronze Age may have been well on its way in the centers of ancient civilization. Palms were found to have grown in northern Greenland, where now for half a year there is darkness, and it is permanently cold. At some time in the remote past, corals grew in Spitsbergen and sequoia forests in Alaska, and it was early understood that the terrestrial axis must have changed its position. Airy, Lord Kelvin, George Darwin, and many others, including Schiaparelli and Simon Newcomb, participated in a long debate on the astronomical and geological possibility of a sudden change in the direction of the terrestrial axis. A debate that was erroneously thought to have started as a consequence of worlds in collision. It was understood that such a change must have taken place unless the strange finds are to be left without explanation. The theory of drifting continents, offered as a substitute, was rejected for many reasons. Jeffrey showed that the mobile force invoked by Wagner is 100 billion times too small to move the continents. Eddington thought that possibly only the crust in its entirety moved, and the axis of the core was left unchanged in direction. But the mobile force he invoked, the tidal inequalities of lunar origin, would not have moved the latitudes out of their places, the directional pull being east to west. W. B. Wright, in his The Quaternary Ice Age, 2nd edition, 1937, says that during geological history there occurred many changes in the position of the climatic zones on the surface of the Earth, which cannot be explained except by a shifting of the axis or a displacement of the pole from its present position. But what could have brought about a change in the inclination of the terrestrial axis to the plane of the ecliptic? I discussed this question in the closing pages of Worlds in Collision and suggested the entrance of the Earth into a strong magnetic field. The newly developed science of paleomagnetism brought and daily continues to bring confirmation of the fact that lavas and igneous rocks in all parts of the world are reversely magnetized. But what is even more startling is to find that the reversely magnetized rocks are 100 times more strongly magnetized than the Earth's magnetic field could have caused them to be. H. Manley, in his review, writes, "It may seem strange that a rock which is made magnetic by the Earth's field should become so strongly magnetized compared to the generating force. This is one of the most astonishing problems of paleomagnetism. Manley also refers to the tests made years ago by G. Fulgumerator and P. L. Mercanton on the clay of ancient Etruscan vases. They were found to have been fired when the vases were closer to the south magnetic pole. Their position during the firing is known because of the flow of the glaze, and the magnetic dip or inclination of the clay is found. Manley writes, this implies that in the 6th century BC, the Earth's magnetic field was reversed in the central Mediterranean area. He speaks also of a general reversal in historical times, 2,500 years ago, that must be cleared up by additional research. Knowing from my study of ancient literary sources the proper time of exogenous disturbances in terrestrial rotation, I suspected an inaccuracy in the last sentence of an otherwise well-written article by Manley. The reversal must have occurred in the 8th century and again in the beginning of the 7th, minus 687. I was gratified to find in the original publication of Professor Mercanton, to whom I directed my inquiry, that the vases with reversed polarity date from the 8th century. I expect that, should the research be extended to vases dating from the end of the Middle Kingdom in Egypt, circa 3,500 years ago, other periods of unnatural polarity would be determined in Egypt and elsewhere. Professor R. Daly of Harvard University found that 3,500 years ago, all over the world, the level of the ocean suddenly dropped. He thought it might be due to a sudden sinking of the crust, and in an authoritative work, Marine Geology, 1950, Professor P.H. Kuenen of the Netherlands finds that this recent shift is now well established. On observations in many places of the world, and he too assigns this catastrophic drop of the ocean level to 3,500 years ago. The recent expedition of the Oceanographic Institute at Gothenburg under H. Peterson, which covered the Atlantic, Pacific, and Indian Oceans, found, according to its leader, evidences of great catastrophes that have altered the face of the earth. He speaks of climatic catastrophes and of tectonic catastrophes that raised or lowered the ocean bottom hundreds, even thousands of feet, spreading huge tidal waves which destroyed plant and animal life on the coastal plains at many places. A lava bed of geologically recent origin was covered only by a thin veneer of sediment. He discovered that the Pacific and Indian Ocean beds consist largely of volcanic ash that had settled on the bottom after great volcanic explosions. He also found a large nickel content in the clay of the ocean bottoms, and decided that this abysmal nickel must have been of meteoric origin. Consequently, he concludes there were very heavy showers of meteors. The principal difficulty of this explanation is that it requires a rate of accretion of meteoric dust several hundred times greater than that which astronomers are presently prepared to admit. Professor Ewing of Columbia University carried on his investigation in the Atlantic in 1949. He published his results and, like Peterson, found that lava spread only recently on the bottom of the ocean. He also came upon signs of land deep on the bottom of the ocean, and concluded either the land must have sunk 2 to 3 miles, or the sea must have been 2 or 3 miles lower than now. Either conclusion is startling. The pollen analysis made by various scientists of the bottom of the North Sea between Germany, England, Scotland, and Norway convinced researchers that this area, in its present shape, originated only very recently, in the subboreal, the date of 1500 before the present era often being selected. At that time there occurred a climastris. Once there had been a sea, then it was covered by debris carried from the mountains of Norway. Later, in a catastrophic advance, the North Sea was formed once more. Human artifacts have been found from time from the time when the North Sea was land. The investigation of the delta formation of the Bear River on the Alaskan border, very carefully made by Hansen, showed that at the present rate of sedimentation, the delta is estimated to be only 3,600 years old. A. de la Parent, the leading French geologist of the beginning of the century, calculated that since the time the Rhone Glacier started to melt, less than 3,000 years have passed. Modern research confirms that many of the alpine glaciers are less than 4,000 years old. Professor Flint of Yale refers to the redetermination of the age of the Upper Great Gorge of Niagara Falls, and writes, 1947, the age of the Upper Great Gorge is calculated as somewhat more than 4,000 years, and to obtain even this low figure, we have to assume that the rate of recession has been constant, although we know that discharge has in fact varied greatly during post-glacial times. Surnander and others demonstrated that in 1500 and again after minus 1800, Surnander and others demonstrated that in minus 1500 and again after minus 800, there occurred climatic catastrophes of global dimensions. These researches, unknown to me when I wrote Worlds in Collision, coincide completely with my conclusions and their dating. In both these periods, the lake dwellings in Switzerland, Germany, northern Italy, and also in Scandinavia were overwhelmed by high water catastrophes and abandoned, the first time for 4 centuries, the second time never to be rebuilt. H. Gams and R. Norhaden showed with very extensive documentation that at these 2 time dates, the lakes of Europe were tilted, and many of them, like Esse and Federsee, were emptied of all their water. The Isartal in the Bavarian Alps was violently torn out, and this in very recent times, and in the Entel in the Tyrol, the many changes of riverbeds were indicative of ground movements on a great scale. H. D. Terra of the Carnegie Institute and Peterson of Harvard came to the conclusion that the Himalayas in violent upheavals reached their present form and height in the age of man, partly even in the time of advanced man. The same conclusion is made concerning the Andes, where, too, the upheaval must have been catastrophic. In the age of man, the Andes rose many thousands of feet amid volcanic activity. In the hills of Montreal and New Hampshire and in Michigan, 500 and 600 feet above sea level, bones of whales have been found. In many places on the earth, in all continents, bones of sea animals and polar land animals and tropical animals have been found in great melees. So also in the Cumberland Cave in Maryland, and in the Chakotine Fissure in China, and in Germany and Denmark. Hippopotami and ostriches were found together with seals and reindeer. Wherever we turn our interest, from the Arctic to the Antarctic, and from sunrise to sunset, in the high mountains and in the deep seas, we find innumerable signs of great upheavals, ancient and recent. A circular meteoric crater, Chubb crater, was discovered in the summer of 1950 in northern Labrador. It covers an area of 4 square miles. It is much larger than the Arizona crater, which is 4/5 of a mile in diameter, 2/3 of a square mile in area, whereas the Arizona crater could accommodate 2 million people in its amphitheater. The Chubb crater could accommodate 12 million people. It must have been created by the impact of an asteroid, according to the published opinion of geological authorities. The asteroid must have fallen about 4,000 years ago. Following or shortly preceding the discovery of the Chubb crater, several other large meteoric craters were discovered in Australia, Arabia, and Mexico. The tens of thousands of oval formations on the Atlantic coast of the United States, especially in the Carolinas. some of them attaining a length of a few miles each, were conclusively identified in a monograph by W.F. Prouty, 1952, as having been caused by a fall of large meteorites. And finally, the largest crater formations situated in Quebec north of Sept Isles in Canada, and occupying an area of 680 square miles. This is under investigation as to its meteoric origin by a group of Mines Department scientists led by Dr. M.J.S. Innes. Of the many other new developments in the field of geology, I would stress some of the results obtained by the radiocarbon method. The time of the Ice Age is moved much closer to our time. Instead of 25,000 years as the terminal date of the last glacial period, it is shown that 10,000 or 11,000 years ago, the ice was still advancing. And even with this low dating, there remain puzzling exceptions. Among them, the finding of mastodons and mammoths in strata only 3,500 years old. Moreover, organic vestiges in the drift of the last glaciation have been found to be of a radiocarbon age pointing to a time 3,500 years ago. Radiocarbon analysis of oil has also shown that in the deposits of the Gulf of Mexico, the age of the oil is measured in thousands of years, not millions. This destroys the main arguments the geologists have raised against the theory of the exogenous origin of some deposits of oil. Worlds in Collision, page 53 and 58, and 369. Hydrocarbons have been identified in cometary tails by spectral analysis. Also, carbohydrates, edible products. But here we are already outside the domain of geology and in the realm of astronomy. Worlds in Collision and recent finds in astronomy. In the years when the manuscript of Worlds in Collision was in the hands of the Macmillan Company, accepted for publication, though not yet published, 1946 to 49, and in the years following, though not yet published, 1946 to 49, the zodiacal light, or the glow seen in the evening sky after sunset, stretching in the path of the sun and other planets, ecliptic, the mysterious origin of which has for a long time occupied the minds of astronomers, has been explained in recent years as the reflection of the solar light from the two rings of dust particles, one following the orbit of Venus, the other in orbit between Mars and Jupiter, places where, according to Worlds in Collision, collisions of planets and a comet took place. The origin of asteroids, or small planets, that circle between Jupiter and Mars, some of which cross the orbit of Mars, and even that of the Earth, has lately been explained as the result of the explosion of a planet, or more recently, 1950, as the result of a collision between two planets in an early age, Kuiper. N.T.
Velikovsky
of the Perkins Observatory offered anew in his own explanation of the origin of the asteroids. They are remnants of a gigantic prehistoric comet. F. Whipple, upon calculating the orbits of the asteroids, came to the conclusion, 1950, two collisions occurred between these bodies and a comet once 4,700 years ago, and the second time 1,500 years ago, or within historical times. These dates of collision in the solar system are of the same order as those offered in Worlds in Collision. Deduced there from historical evidence and testimony of C. Tombaugh, the discoverer of Pluto, explained, 1950. The dark areas and the canals of Mars are resulting from collisions of Mars with asteroids. According to Worlds in Collision, Mars was involved in repeated collisions with large cometary masses. Actually, in January 1950, an explosion observed on Mars was interpreted by oceanic as a collision with an asteroid. Clouds of dust of continental dimensions rose and screened surface features of the planet. O. Sturvey of Yerkes Observatory reviewed the achievements of astronomy during 1950, wrote that, by a bizarre coincidence, in that year, a deluge of sound papers on collisions within the solar system followed on the heels of worlds in collision. There are two theories concerning the origin of lunar craters. Their size is enormous. Nothing comparable is known on Earth. According to one theory, these craters are the result of a collision of the Moon with very large meteorites of the size of asteroids. According to the other theory, they are volcanic formations. Both theories assumed very violent events in which the celestial body closest to the Earth was involved. In Worlds in Collision, I offered the following explanation of the lunar craters, as well as of the seas of lava and the rifts of the lunar surface. During the great catastrophes, when the Moon, together with the terrestrial globe, passed through the fabric of a great comet, and again when, in the 8th century before the present era, the Earth and the Moon were strongly perturbed by Mars. The Moon's surface flowed with lava and bubbled into great circular formations, which rapidly cooled off in the long lunar night, unprotected by an atmosphere from the coolness of cosmic spaces. In these cosmic collisions and near contacts, the surface of the Moon was also marked by clefts and rifts. If the circular formations on the Moon are these bubbles which collapsed, then probably there are smaller bubbles on the Moon that have not yet burst. Dr. H. Percy Wilkins, the English selenographer, actually found over 40 unexploded bubbles or domes on the Moon, several of which lie to the northeast of Copernicus crater. The largest of these is found within Darwin crater and is 20 miles in diameter. According to an article by F. Benario in Vega, 1953, I have expressed my opinion that many comets are of recent origin, and I have supported this view by reference to the frequency and luminosity of comets in the days of imperial Rome, in comparison to the number of comets visible to the unaided eye in the last centuries. This notion received vigorous confirmation in the extensive work on comets done in Soviet Russia by a leading authority on the subject, Professor S.K. Velikovsky. His research reveals that periodic comets, as observed during recent decades, are losing their luminosity and their matter at a rate so rapid that 50 or 60 revolutions suffice to degenerate a comet completely. Thus, the Halley comet can hardly go back beyond 3,500 years, or the year 1500 before the present era. In the last century, several comets with short periods have failed to return, having apparently lost all their matter, and a few others actually fell apart before the eyes of observers. The rapid decay of comets excludes the possibility that they have belonged to our solar system from the beginning, or from the time the planets were formed. The theory that sees in comets bodies that arrived from other solar systems has been generally abandoned. Velikovsky also shows why we must reject a theory of the capture of comets from a cloud of dust and gases through which our solar system presumably passed sometime in the past. He comes to the conclusion that the comets were born in eruptions from planets, even from satellites like our Moon, where circular formations indicate violent events in the past. but the main activity must have taken place on Jupiter and Saturn, the major planets, as the form of orbits of the short-period comets suggest. This is a revival of the theory of R. Proctor, who 70 years ago ascribed the origin of the so-called Jovian family of comets, comprising the majority of comets of short periods, to eruptions from Jupiter. The gases of Jupiter and Saturn are in violent motion, despite their low temperatures. Yet the velocity necessary for escape from the major planets is so great, 60 kilometers per second from Jupiter, that Velikovsky admits not knowing the mechanism that could, in conditions presently prevailing on major planets, impart this velocity to the exploded matter. Nevertheless, Velikovsky insists that in the recent past conditions on these planets must have been such that this was possible, even if these conditions cannot be defined. He emphasizes that by casting off the exploded matter, planets must have changed their own masses and consequently their orbits. They must also have experienced recoils. And that's what I thought. Shedding matter while they're moving away. Yes, that would be acclimating their charge, wouldn't it? In the publications of the Kiev Observatory for 1953, Velikovsky says, "The history of the planetary system was characterized, we assume, by definitely more rapid changes and more active physical processes than appeared when only gravitational interrelations in the solar system were taken into account. All this is in complete harmony with the conclusions at which I arrived in Worlds in Collision. Concerning the time, a few thousand years ago, of the birth of comets of short periods and their origin by eruption from the planets, especially the major planets. There I also explained the forces or conditions that caused the major planets to eject the cometary masses. The near collision between major planets brought about the birth of comets. Now my claim, based on historical material, that the composition of the solar system was changed in historical times, is given the support of observation and calculation. The electromagnetic nature of the universe, deduced in Worlds in Collision from a series of historical phenomena, is supported by another series of recent observations. At Evans Signal Laboratory of the United States Army Signal Corps in Belmar, New Jersey, researchers conducting pioneer experiments on the reception of radar echoes from the moon detected noises coming from the sun. These noises point to discharges of strong potentials. In the fall of 1947, at the meeting of the British Association for the Advancement of Science, Sir Edmund Appleton reported that radio noises coming from the sun coincide with solar flares. According to him, a sunspot is the most powerful ultra-short-wave radio station known, its power being much greater than 1,000,000 kilowatts. In 1948 and 49, Donald Menzel produced motion pictures of prominences or explosions of matter on the sun. They were made at the Solar Observatory in Climax, Colorado. What a name. The exposed matter rose at a very great speed to immense heights, all the time gaining in velocity, and then descended to the sun, not on a curved path as a missile would do, but by retreating on the path it covered, comparable to a missile reversing its direction and returning to its point of departure. Moreover, the velocity of its descent was without the acceleration expected in a fall, and this, too, was in violation of gravitational mechanics. It has been observed that when perturbances or surges of exploded matter on the sun run into one another, both of them recoil violently. Such observation was made by McMath and Sawyer. and on another occasion by Lyot. The conclusion drawn by E. Pettit of the Mount Wilson Observatory in 1951 is that solar protuberances are electrically charged. Above the protuberances, the coronal structure is often bent into the form of an arch, sometimes into several concentric arches. This is additional evidence of the electrical nature of the protuberances and corona. In the configuration of the cometary nuclei and tails, there was found good evidence that all particles in the comet influence the motion of each other, and in the configuration of the streamers in the tails of many comets strongly indicate a mutual repulsion. Thus wrote Professor N.T. Velikovsky, director of the Perkins Observatory, 1951, it is also calculated that the repulsion of the tails of the comets by the sun is 20,000 times stronger than the gravitational attraction. And the implication is that it cannot be caused by the pressure of light, as previously thought, and that electrical repulsion must be in action. From spectral analysis, it is known that the cometary tails do not shine merely by reflected light, and that their light is not caused by combustion either, but most probably is an electrical effect comparable to the effect of a Geissler tube. In order to explain the general magnetic field of the terrestrial globe, Dr. E.C. Bullard of Great Britain's National Physical Laboratory assumed electrical currents in the liquid metal core of the Earth. The polar lights have been explained by various scientists as electrical charges arriving from the sun. Following disturbances on the sun, there is an immediate disturbance in the ionosphere and radio transmission, ground currents, and the magnetic field of the Earth. There is also a second retarded but pronounced reaction about 25 hours later, and auroral displays. In 1948, Enrico Fermi explained the electromagnetically high charges of the cosmic rays as a result of the positive particles having traveled through magnetic fields in space. In 1951, Richmeyer and Teller followed an earlier idea of Swan, explained these charges as originating from the sun. Protons and heavy nuclei could be accelerated to the enormous velocity of cosmic ray particles by an extended magnetic field of solar origin. Both theories assume the existence of magnetic fields in space. I could add to this that if the Earth is a negatively charged body, the great energy with which positive charges, the cosmic rays, rush toward the Earth is not in the least enigmatic. Holy crap. Kind of gives pause for those microbursts that one guy talks about. I mean, the sun could probably sneeze half an Earth and send it our way, and it would immediately bury whatever it landed on. And maybe that's the reason oceans become mountains and mountains become oceans. Come to think of it, that's a scary thought. It would just be a matter of time. I hope those are giant spaceships shooting whatever comes out of the sun. And you got all these billionaires talking about getting off planet. See, what do they know that we don't? Well, maybe we're learning. We are entering a magnetic fluff that we're going to be in for 10,000 years, as a matter of fact. It's in my next space show. Maybe I should read it now. Plus the sun is at like an all-time minimum. Man, I'm gonna have to find out what Thunderbolts has to say about that. A negatively charged body attracts positive charges. At Mount Wilson Observatory, Harold Babcock determined, 1947, that some of the fixed stars possess general magnetic fields of great intensity. Babcock's the guy who fired Halton R. One of the stars was found to reverse its polarity every 9 days. from plus 7,000 Gauss to minus 6,300 Gauss. This may be understood as a sign that the star is rotating, turning another pole to us every 9 days. The star shows no Zeeman effect in between. That is, when the observer is in the plane of the equatorial belt of the star, in the same position in which we are permanently in relation to our Sun. In 1952, the Royal Astronomer Sir Harold Spencer Jones estimated that magnetic properties were established in more than 100 stars, and the number of identified magnetic stars is rapidly growing. I have not heard of magnetic stars until just recently. Several years ago, Dr. J.S. Hall of the United States Naval Observatory and Dr. W. Hiltner of Yerkes Observatory, actually it's Yerkes, Wikipedia says to pronounce it that way, Yerkes Observatory found that the light from certain stars is strongly polarized. It was surmised that starlight must pass through particles of magnetized interstellar dust. The question raised was why the particles of dust should all be orientated in the same direction as their magnetic axis. However, if these clouds of dust are electrically charged and in motion, the common magnetic orientation of these particles is only natural. In 1950, W. Bade of Palomar and L. Spitzer of Princeton offered a theory of colliding galaxies. By November 1952, it was definitely spoken of as a titanic collision of two giant star clusters behind the constellation Cygnus, the swan, of the Milky Way. The fact of the big crash was substantiated by strong evidence. The radio noises coming from beyond the Milky Way and sifted through it. Galaxies, each as large as the Milky Way, with numberless stars, were riding one through another, colliding and sending out a terrible SOS through the universe in the form of anguished radio noises. These signals were interpreted by Bade and K. Minkowski as the reverberations of crashes on a galactic scale. After millions of years of traveling with the velocity of light, these signals reached our radio telescopes as clearly audible noises. They left the place of the catastrophes so long ago. Yet, because of the magnitude of galaxies, the collision is possibly still going on. The signals that are emitted today will reach our solar system when our Sun may have already turned into a dwarf star and our planet into clouds of dust. No. Not only the fact of the collision of galaxies startled the astronomers, but even more the medium through which it became known. The colliding galaxies send electromagnetic signals, thus evidencing the electromagnetic structure of galaxies and of the very space of the universe. By August 1953, the statement was made that another celestial host of stars was charging on a rival galaxy in the direction of the sky where we see the Crab Nebula, and still another collision was going on behind the constellation Cassiopeia. In March 1951 issue of RCA Review, John H. Nelson of the Engineering Department of RCA Communications Incorporated, that's Radio Corporation of America, corporation or company, announced the results of several years of careful observations on the dependence of regular radio transmission on the position of planets in the solar system. He drew graphs and wrote, "It can be readily seen from these graphs that disturbed conditions show good correlation with planetary configurations. It is definitely shown that each of the 6 planets studied is effective in some configurations." The press reported evidence of a strange and unexplained correlation between the positions of Jupiter, Saturn, and Mars in their orbits around the Sun and the presence of violent electrical disturbances in the Earth's upper atmosphere seems to indicate that the planets and the Sun share in a cosmic electrical balance mechanism that extends 1 billion miles from the center of our solar system. Such an electrical balance is not accounted for in current astrophysical theories. Short-wave frequencies are disturbed when Jupiter, Saturn, and Mars line up, either in a straight line or at right angles to one another. Nelson emphasized that the phenomenon is not due to gravitational effect or tidal poles between planets and the Sun. Actually, the phenomenon indicates that the planets are electrically charged bodies. In this connection, the older theory of a direct but unexplained relation between the revolution of Jupiter and the sunspot cycle is seen in a new light. Also, the observation of Stetson of the Massachusetts Institute of Technology that the moon affects radio reception. It is twice as good when the moon is under the horizon as when it is overhead. Belongs in the same category as Nelson's observation of planetary influences on the ionosphere. Stetson thought this effect was caused by some radiation emanating from the moon. For a neutral moon could not produce the phenomenon. In 1953, the strange fact was established that the solar tides in the Earth's atmosphere are 16 times more powerful than the lunar tides in the atmosphere, a fact in complete conflict with the tidal theory, according to which the action of the moon on oceanic tides is several times more powerful than that of the Sun. The 50-fold discrepancy is still without an acceptable explanation. These are only a few of the recent discoveries that make a revision of the mechanistic concept of the universe quite mandatory. Make a revision of the mechanistic concept of the universe quite mandatory. That's something. I've learned more just from reading this essay or speech than I have watching the last 10 or 15 mainstream programs. You just learn the same stuff over there. They would never tell us things like this. Exactly because of the accuracy achieved without reckoning with forces that appear to exist. Celestial mechanics, a solid work of great mathematical minds for almost 3 centuries, may seem even more in need of such revision. All this has little direct bearing on the story of Worlds in Collision, which claims only the effect to be expected if a magnetic body like the Earth should come very close to another magnetic body. It was my skepticism concerning the infallibility of the celestial mechanics, which assumes the celestial bodies to be electrically and magnetically sterile, that was the real cause of the emotional outburst. Let us think of a binary or double star. Both stars revolve around each other, or a common center. A half-revolution period of a few days, or only hours, is common. Let us assume that the stars of the binary are magnets, 7,000 Gauss strong. It is immediately obvious that even should the electrical component of the electromagnets be disregarded, these stars are not moving in a system purely mechanical. But this is enough to render the purely mechanical celestial system fallible in respect also to single stars, and equally so to the Sun and its planets. In Jupiter and its moons, we have several not unlike the solar family. The planet is cold, yet its gases are in motion. It appears probable to me that it sends out radio noises, as do the Sun and the stars. I suggest that this be investigated. Uranus is the only planet about which we know that for a considerable part of its revolution it turns one of its poles toward us. If the gases on Uranus are not in turbulent motion, but have a smooth reflecting surface, I would expect the solar light reflected from the polar regions of Uranus to be polarized. As is well known, light reflected from the poles of a magnet is polarized. It is generally thought that the magnetic field of the Earth does not sensitively reach to the Moon, but there is a way to find out whether it does or not. The Moon makes daily rocking movements. They found out that it does. Librations of latitude, some of which are explained by no theory. I suggest investigating whether these unaccounted librations are synchronized with the daily revolutions of the magnetic poles of the Earth around its geographical poles. C. Payne Gaposchkin of Harvard, who in the last years has written many long articles against the theory of worlds in collision, in which she asserted that the celestial bodies could not possibly possess electrostatic charges enough to produce any of the observed effects on the motion within the solar system, now makes, in the September 1953 issue of the Scientific American, this confession. 10 years ago, in our hypothesis of cosmic evolution, we were thinking in terms of gravitation and light pressure. Light pressure. That's almost ridiculous. Tomorrow, we may contemplate a galaxy that is essentially a gravitating turbulent electromagnet. There will be more concessions as time goes on. Our Sun and its planets are not outside a galaxy. They are not unique or an exception in the plan of the universe. I like to tell this story. Once in the twilight hour, a visitor came to my study, a distinguished-looking gentleman. He brought me a manuscript dealing with celestial mechanics. This is my favorite one. After a glance at some of the pages, I had the feeling that this was the work of a mathematical genius. I entered into a conversation with my visitor and mentioned the name of James Clerk Maxwell. My guest asked, "Who is he?" Embarrassed, I answered, "You know, the scientist who gave a theoretical explanation of the experiments of Faraday."
"And who is Faraday?"
inquired the stranger. In growing embarrassment, I said, "Of course, the man who did the pioneer work in electromagnetism."
"And what is electromagnetism?"
asked the gentleman. "What is your name?" I inquired. He answered,
"Isaac Newton."
I awoke. On my knees was an open volume, Newton's Principia. This story is told to illustrate what I have said before. Would you listen to anybody discuss the mechanics of the spheres who does not know the elementary physical forces existing in nature? But this is the position adopted by astronomers, who acclaim as infallible a celestial mechanics conceived in the 1660s, in which electricity and magnetism play not the slightest role. In the fields of archaeology, geology, and astronomy, The last few years have brought a vast array of facts to corroborate the claim made in Worlds in Collision that there were physical upheavals of a global character in historical times, that these catastrophes were caused by extraterrestrial agents, and that the nature of these agents may be identified, although I arrived at results in conflict with orthodox beliefs. Yet, recent years have disclosed new observations and findings, all in support and none in refutation. What I want to impress upon you is that science today, as in the days of Newton, lies before us as a great uncharted ocean, and we have not yet sailed very far from the coast of ignorance. In the study of the human soul, we have learned only a few mechanisms of behavior as directed from the subconscious mind, but we do not know what thinking is or what memory is. And in biology, we do not know what life is. The age of basic discoveries is not yet at its end, and you are not latecomers, for whom no fundamentals are left to discover. As I see so many of you today, I visualize some of you 10 or 20 or 30 years from now as fortunate discoverers, those of you who possess inquisitive and challenging minds, the will to persist, and the urge to store knowledge. Don't be afraid to face facts, and never lose your ability to ask the question, why and how? Be in this like a child. Don't be afraid of ridicule. Think of the history of all the great discoveries. I quote Alfred North Whitehead. If you have had your attention directed to the novelties of thought in your own lifetime, you will have observed that almost all really new ideas have a certain aspect of foolishness when they are first produced. Therefore, dare, and should even the great ones of your age try to discourage you, think of the greatest scientist of antiquity, Archimedes, who jeered at the theory of Aristarchus, 25 years his senior, that the earth revolves around the sun. Untruth in science may live for centuries, and you may not see yourself vindicated. But dare. Don't persist in your idea if the facts are against it, but do persist if you see facts gathering on your side. It may be that even the strongest opposition, that of figures, will crumble before the facts. The greatest mathematician who ever walked on these shores, Simon Newcomb, proved in 1903 that a flying machine carrying a pilot is a mathematical impossibility. In the same year of 1903, the Wright brothers, without mathematics, but by a fact, proved him wrong. In religion, the great revelations and the great authorities, the founding fathers, belong to the past, and the older the authority, the greater it is. In science, unlike religion, the great revelations lie in the future. The coming generations are the authorities, and the pupil is greater than the master. If he has the gift to see things anew, all fruitful ideas have been conceived in the minds of the nonconformists, for whom the known was still unknown, and who often went back to begin where others passed by, sure of their way. The truth of today was the hearsay of yesterday. Imagination coupled with skepticism and an ability to wonder, if you possess these bountiful, nature will hand you some of the secrets out of her inexhaustible store. The pleasure you will experience in discovering truth will repay you for your work. Don't expect other compensation, because it may not come, yet dare. Excellent. Hear, hear. All those years ago, he gave this speech It must have seemed that they were on the precipice of changing the paradigm, and it was just a matter of time. 60-some years later, with the same paradigm. Amazing.